In the marble halls of Renaissance Florence, where shadows danced between columns and whispers carried more weight than gold, a truth emerged that would forever alter mankind's understanding of power. It was not a truth born of philosophy or divine revelation, but one carved from the raw observation of human nature in its most unguarded moments. This truth, as uncomfortable as it was undeniable, spoke of wolves who learned to walk among sheep, not through deception, but through the mastery of their own fundamental nature. The great courts of Europe had always been theaters where men performed their greatest roles, but beneath the velvet doublets and jeweled crowns lay a more primal drama. Here, in these palaces of supposed civilization, the ancient laws of survival played out with a sophistication that would have made the beasts of the wild envious. For while a wolf in the forest kills for sustenance, a wolf in the court kills for something far more intoxicating: the preservation and expansion of power itself. Consider the man who arrives at court with nothing but his wit and ambition. He observes the rituals of nobility, the carefully choreographed dances of diplomacy, the elaborate codes of honor that govern every interaction. To the untrained eye, these appear to be the pillars of civilized society, the very foundations upon which order rests. But, to the man who would be wolf, they reveal themselves as something else entirely: the chains by which the strong voluntarily bind themselves, the comfortable cages in which eagles choose to live as chickens. The weak man sees virtue as his shield, believing that goodness will protect him from the storms of political life. He speaks of honor as if it were a magical talisman, capable of turning aside the blades of ambition and the arrows of treachery. He builds his life upon the assumption that others, seeing his righteousness, will treat him with the same consideration he shows them. This is the fundamental delusion that separates the sheep from the wolves, the rulers from the ruled. But the man who would survive and thrive in the arena of power understands that virtue, while admirable in theory, is a luxury that can only be afforded by those who first secure their position through more practical means. He recognizes that the world is not governed by the principles taught in childhood but by the harsh mathematics of necessity. In this calculus, good intentions count for nothing if they lead to destruction, while actions that violate conventional morality may be essential for the preservation of order itself. The transformation from sheep to wolf does not happen overnight, nor does it occur through the adoption of cruelty for its own sake. Rather, it emerges through the gradual recognition that the weak self, the part of man that seeks approval, that flinches from necessary harshness, that mistakes kindness for wisdom, is the very aspect of his nature that renders him vulnerable to those who have no such limitations. The man who would be powerful must first wage war against his own compassionate impulses, not because compassion is inherently wrong, but because it can be weaponized against him by those who feel no such constraints. In the corridors of the Vatican, where temporal and spiritual power intertwined in ways that would have horrified the apostles, this lesson played out with particular clarity. Here, men who had dedicated their lives to the service of God found themselves navigating political waters that would challenge the most seasoned of secular rulers. The successful among them learned that serving a higher purpose sometimes required actions that seemed to contradict that very purpose. They discovered that protecting the church might mean lying to its enemies, that preserving the faith might require the destruction of the faithful who threatened its unity. This was not hypocrisy but, rather, the recognition of a fundamental truth about power: it exists in a realm beyond conventional morality, where the ordinary rules of human interaction must give way to the extraordinary demands of leadership. The weak man sees this as corruption, a falling away from pure ideals into the mire of compromise and calculation. The strong man recognizes it as evolution, the necessary development that allows one to operate effectively in a world where ideals alone provide no protection against those who would destroy them. The process of becoming a wolf among sheep begins with the destruction of illusions, particularly the illusion that the world operates according to principles of fairness and reciprocity. The man who clings to these beliefs will find himself repeatedly betrayed, not because he is unlucky, but because he has fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the game he is playing. He enters what he believes to be a chess match only to discover that his opponents are playing by the rules of war, where the only victory that matters is the one that allows you to dictate terms to the defeated. Once these illusions are stripped away, what remains is a clearer understanding of human motivation. Men are not, despite their protestations, primarily driven by noble ideals or abstract principles. They are driven by fear, desire, ambition, and the need to secure their position in a world where security is never guaranteed. The successful leader learns to read these deeper currents, to understand what men truly want beneath what they claim to want, and to provide it in ways that serve his own purposes. This understanding extends to the recognition that most people prefer to be led rather than to lead, despite their occasional protests to the contrary. The burden of making difficult decisions, of taking responsibility for outcomes, of standing alone when necessary, these are weights that most souls cannot bear for long. They seek the comfort of following someone who appears strong enough to carry these burdens for them, even if that strength sometimes manifests in ways that make them uncomfortable. The weak self resists this knowledge because it implies a view of humanity that contradicts the flattering portrait painted by conventional wisdom. It suggests that the majority of people are not the rational, independent actors that democratic theory presupposes, but rather creatures driven by emotions and needs they barely understand, desperately seeking someone who can provide them with direction and security. To accept this is to accept responsibility not just for one's own actions, but for the actions of those who choose to follow. This responsibility is what separates the true wolf from the mere predator. The predator uses his understanding of human weakness for purely selfish ends, consuming what he needs and discarding the rest. The wolf, by contrast, recognizes that his power is ultimately dependent upon the welfare of his pack. He must be strong enough to make the hard choices that others cannot make, cruel enough to eliminate threats that compassionate people would tolerate, and wise enough to know when mercy serves his purposes better than justice. The courtiers of the Medici learned this lesson through bitter experience. Those who attempted to navigate the treacherous waters of Florentine politics through virtue alone found themselves outmaneuvered by those who understood that virtue was merely one tool among many, to be employed when useful and discarded when it became a liability. The successful understood that appearing virtuous was often more important than being virtuous, and that the perception of strength could sometimes substitute for strength itself, while the perception of weakness was invariably fatal. In the great game of power, reputation becomes a weapon as potent as any sword. The man who is known to be ruthless when necessary finds that he rarely needs to exercise that ruthlessness, as potential opponents choose not to test him. The man who is known to be consistently virtuous, by contrast, invites attack from those who count on his virtue to prevent him from responding effectively to their aggression. This creates a paradox that the weak mind cannot resolve. Sometimes one must be willing to appear evil in order to do good, and sometimes one must actually do evil in order to prevent greater evil. The destruction of the weak self requires the acceptance of this paradox. It demands the recognition that moral purity, while beautiful in theory, can be a form of selfishness when it prevents one from taking the actions necessary to protect others. The leader who allows his realm to fall into chaos because he refuses to employ harsh measures when they are needed has chosen his own moral comfort over the welfare of his people. His virtue becomes a vice, his strength a weakness, his good intentions a pathway to hell. Part 2, The Art of Strategic Ruthlessness. The second phase of transformation from sheep to wolf involves the mastery of what can only be called strategic ruthlessness, the ability to employ harsh measures with precision and purpose rather than from impulse or cruelty. This is perhaps the most misunderstood aspect of political power, often confused with mere brutality or sadism by those who have never faced the terrible responsibility of command. True strategic ruthlessness is an art form, requiring not just the strength to act against natural compassion, but the wisdom to know when such action serves the greater good and the discipline to limit it to what is absolutely necessary. In the courts of the Borgias, this art was practiced with a sophistication that both horrified and fascinated observers. Here was a family that understood power not as a privilege to be enjoyed but as a responsibility to be exercised with mathematical precision. When Cesare Borgia eliminated potential rivals, he did so not from personal animosity but from the cold calculation that their continued existence posed a threat to the stability of his realm. When he broke promises that had become inconvenient, he did so not from casual dishonesty but from the recognition that the changed circumstances made those promises obstacles to the greater good. To the weak-minded observer, these actions appeared to be simple villainy, the behavior of a man who had abandoned all moral constraints in pursuit of selfish goals. But, to those who understood the deeper principles at work, they revealed themselves as something more complex, the actions of a man who had accepted the burden of making decisions that others could not make, bearing the moral cost of actions that preserved order and prevented greater suffering. The key to understanding strategic ruthlessness lies in recognizing the difference between cruelty and necessity. Cruelty seeks to inflict suffering for its own sake, drawing pleasure from the pain of others and causing harm beyond what circumstances require. Necessity, by contrast, accepts suffering as an unavoidable cost of achieving essential goals, taking no pleasure in the pain inflicted but recognizing it as the price that must be paid for greater benefits. The cruel man destroys because he can, the strategically ruthless man destroys because he must. This distinction becomes crucial when examining the methods by which successful leaders eliminate opposition. The crude tyrant relies on terror and spectacle, believing that excessive brutality will cow his enemies into submission. Such an approach often achieves short-term compliance but at the cost of long-term stability, as it creates martyrs and hardens resistance rather than eliminating it. The strategic practitioner, by contrast, moves with surgical precision, removing threats in ways that minimize backlash while maximizing the deterrent effect on potential future opposition. Consider the problem of the traitorous advisor, a man whose position grants him access to sensitive information and whose loyalty has become questionable. The weak leader, operating from conventional moral assumptions, might attempt to reform the man through appeals to honor and duty, hoping that reminders of past friendship and shared values will restore his allegiance. This approach satisfies the leader's sense of virtue but leaves the fundamental problem unresolved, as a man who has once betrayed trust has demonstrated his willingness to do so again when circumstances favor it. The strategically ruthless leader faces this same situation with different calculations. He recognizes that the traitorous advisor represents not just a current threat but a future one, and that allowing him to remain in position signals to other potential traitors that disloyalty carries no serious consequences. The solution, therefore, is not reform but removal, but the manner of that removal requires careful consideration of multiple factors beyond the immediate satisfaction of justice. If the advisor is eliminated publicly and brutally, it sends a clear message about the consequences of betrayal but may also create sympathy for the victim and fear among the loyal, who begin to wonder if they too might someday fall victim to their leader's suspicions. If he is allowed to quietly retire or transfer to a harmless position, it preserves the illusion of mercy but may be interpreted as weakness, encouraging others to test the leader's resolve. The optimal solution might involve a middle path, private confrontation that offers the advisor a choice between voluntary exile and involuntary destruction, allowing him to preserve some dignity while ensuring his removal from the sphere of influence. Such calculations require a form of emotional detachment that runs counter to natural human instincts. The man who would be strategically ruthless must learn to view people not as individuals with inherent worth, though he may recognize their worth in other contexts, but as pieces on a board, each with capabilities and loyalties that must be assessed and managed for the good of the whole. This does not mean he becomes incapable of genuine affection or loyalty, but rather that he learns to separate his personal feelings from his professional decisions. The development of this capacity often involves a process that can only be described as the systematic hardening of the heart. The future leader learns to witness suffering without being paralyzed by compassion, to make decisions that cause pain without being consumed by guilt, to inspire fear without being corrupted by the power to terrify. This hardening is not the result of moral corruption but of moral evolution, the recognition that the luxury of tender feelings is one that leaders cannot afford when the welfare of many depends upon their ability to act decisively in difficult circumstances. The mastery of strategic ruthlessness also requires understanding the psychology of those who would oppose you. Most people operate from predictable patterns of behavior, driven by fears and desires that can be mapped and exploited. The man who threatens your position likely does so from his own insecurity, seeking to elevate himself by diminishing you. The subordinate who questions your decisions in public may be motivated less by genuine concern than by a desire to appear wise in the eyes of others. Understanding these deeper motivations allows you to address problems at their source rather than merely dealing with their surface manifestations. In the papal courts, where spiritual authority intermingled with temporal power in ways that created unique challenges, this psychological understanding proved especially valuable. Here, men who had taken vows of poverty and humility often found themselves wielding influence over the fate of nations, creating internal contradictions that could be exploited by those who understood how to play upon them. A cardinal who genuinely believed in his spiritual mission could be motivated by appeals to the good of the church, while one who had entered religious life for worldly advancement could be controlled through more material considerations. The successful papal politician learned to read these differences quickly and accurately, adapting his approach to the psychological profile of each individual he encountered. With the genuine believer, he framed his requests in terms of spiritual benefit; with the worldly climber, he offered opportunities for advancement; with the fearful, he provided either reassurance or additional cause for concern, depending on what best served his purposes. In each case, the approach was tailored to the specific psychology of the target, maximizing the likelihood of compliance while minimizing the resources required to achieve it. This psychological sophistication extends to understanding the relationship between fear and respect in the maintenance of power. The weak leader often confuses these two emotions, believing that being feared is the same as being respected, or conversely, that being respected eliminates the need to be feared. The strategically sophisticated understand that both elements are necessary and that the optimal balance between them depends on circumstances and the nature of those being governed. Fear without respect creates compliance without loyalty, ensuring that your authority lasts only as long as your ability to enforce it through strength. When that strength wavers, or when circumstances provide an opportunity for rebellion, those who have been governed purely through fear will turn against you with a vengeance proportional to the resentment they have accumulated. Respect without fear, conversely, may win affection but provides no deterrent against those who would challenge your position for their own advancement, as they calculate that their admiration for your character will prevent you from responding effectively to their aggression. The optimal combination involves earning respect for your competence, wisdom, and dedication to the welfare of those you lead, while maintaining enough capacity for ruthless action that potential challengers understand the serious consequences of opposing you. This creates what might be called loving fear, the emotion felt by those who genuinely appreciate your leadership but understand that crossing you would be unwise. It is the feeling a wolf pack has toward its alpha, deep loyalty combined with healthy wariness. Achieving this balance requires constant calibration, as the needs of different situations call for different emphases. In times of stability, the emphasis can shift toward respect, as the daily exercise of competent leadership builds confidence and loyalty among followers. In times of crisis or challenge, the emphasis must shift toward fear, as potential opponents need to be reminded of the costs of opposition and potential allies need to be assured of your strength. The timing of ruthless action becomes crucial in maintaining this balance. Act too quickly, and you may appear paranoid or trigger-happy, undermining the respect component of your authority. Act too slowly, and you may appear weak or indecisive, encouraging further challenges. The skilled practitioner develops an intuitive sense for the optimal moment, the point at which a problem has become serious enough to justify harsh measures but has not yet grown so serious as to require desperate ones. This intuitive timing often depends on understanding the broader political environment in which you operate. In a context where your position is secure and your authority well established, you can afford to be patient with minor challenges, allowing potential opponents to reveal the extent of their capabilities and intentions before responding. In a more precarious situation, where your authority is still developing or under serious threat, swift and decisive action may be necessary to prevent small problems from becoming large ones. Part 3, The Eternal Vigilance of the Alpha. The final phase of the transformation from sheep to wolf involves the recognition that power, once gained, requires eternal vigilance to maintain. Unlike material possessions that can be locked away for safekeeping, power exists only in the dynamic relationship between ruler and ruled, constantly subject to challenge, erosion, and usurpation. The man who believes that achieving a position of authority marks the end of his struggles has fundamentally misunderstood the nature of power itself. For the true alpha, the achievement of dominance marks not the end of the hunt but the beginning of a new and more complex form of survival. The courts of Europe provided countless examples of rulers who had successfully climbed to the pinnacle of power only to lose it through complacency, overconfidence, or the simple failure to understand that their position depended on factors beyond their control. Even the mightiest emperor ruled only through the consent of those with the power to overthrow him, whether that consent was given willingly or extracted through fear. The moment that consent was withdrawn, whether through rebellion, coup, or simple indifference, the emperor found himself merely another man with opinions that no one was obliged to obey. This fundamental vulnerability of power creates what can only be described as a state of existential insecurity for those who wield it. No matter how secure your position may appear, no matter how loyal your followers or how weakened your enemies, the possibility of overthrow remains a constant specter haunting every decision. This is not paranoia but realism, an accurate assessment of the precarious nature of human authority in a world where circumstances change rapidly and loyalty is often contingent on continued success. The weak man finds this reality unbearable and either retreats from power altogether or attempts to rule through methods that ignore it. He seeks to create an atmosphere of universal love and harmony, believing that if he can make everyone sufficiently happy, he will eliminate the motivation for opposition. This approach occasionally succeeds in times of prosperity and external peace, but it invariably fails when circumstances become challenging and difficult decisions must be made. The leader who has built his authority on universal approval finds himself without the tools necessary to govern when approval becomes impossible to maintain. The wolf, by contrast, accepts insecurity as the natural condition of leadership and builds his methods around this reality. Rather than seeking to eliminate all potential threats, an impossible task, he focuses on managing them in ways that serve his long-term interests. He understands that some level of opposition is not only inevitable but actually beneficial, as it provides early warning of developing problems and gives him opportunities to demonstrate his strength to wavering supporters. This acceptance of perpetual challenge requires a particular kind of mental discipline. The ruler must remain constantly alert to shifts in the political landscape without allowing this vigilance to paralyze him with indecision. He must be suspicious enough to detect genuine threats while remaining confident enough to take the calculated risks that effective leadership demands. He must prepare for the worst possible outcomes while projecting the optimism necessary to inspire others to follow him toward better ones. The development of this discipline often involves what can be called the cultivation of strategic paranoia, a heightened awareness of potential threats that stops short of the debilitating fear that characterizes actual paranoia. The strategically paranoid leader assumes that his enemies are intelligent, well-informed, and constantly seeking opportunities to undermine him, but he does not allow this assumption to prevent him from taking necessary actions or forming useful alliances. Instead, he uses it to sharpen his planning and improve his defensive measures. This mental state requires careful maintenance, as it exists in a narrow zone between insufficient caution and excessive anxiety. The leader who is insufficiently cautious will be blindsided by threats he should have seen coming, while the leader who is excessively anxious will exhaust himself and his supporters through unnecessary defensive measures and missed opportunities. Finding the optimal balance requires both self-knowledge and accurate assessment of external conditions and understanding of your own psychological tendencies combined with realistic evaluation of the actual level of threat you face. The maintenance of power also requires understanding the cyclical nature of political fortune. Periods of strength alternate with periods of vulnerability according to patterns that, while not entirely predictable, follow certain general principles. The newly established leader faces different challenges than the long-entrenched one. The ruler during times of prosperity must prepare for different threats than the ruler during times of crisis. Understanding these cycles allows the wise leader to adapt his methods to changing circumstances rather than rigidly applying techniques that may have worked in the past but are unsuited to present conditions. During periods of strength, when your position is secure and your enemies are weak, the primary danger comes not from external threats but from internal complacency. Success breeds confidence, and confidence can easily become overconfidence, leading to the kind of strategic mistakes that create opportunities for your opponents. The wise leader uses periods of strength not for relaxation but for preparation, building reserves of loyalty, resources, and strategic options that will serve him when circumstances become more challenging. During periods of vulnerability, when external pressures mount and internal support wavers, the temptation is often to become reactive, responding to each crisis as it emerges rather than maintaining strategic coherence. The skilled practitioner resists this temptation by maintaining focus on long-term objectives while adapting tactics to immediate necessities. He recognizes that temporary setbacks are inevitable but that permanent defeat comes only from abandoning the principles that brought him to power in the first place. The intelligence networks that successful rulers develop serve not merely as sources of information but as early warning systems for shifts in the political environment. These networks must be carefully constructed and maintained, as the quality of intelligence often determines the difference between survival and destruction. The ruler needs to know not just what his enemies are planning but what his allies are thinking, not just what is happening in public but what is being discussed in private, not just what people are saying but what they are carefully not saying. Building effective intelligence networks requires understanding the motivations of those who provide information. Some are motivated by loyalty and provide intelligence because they genuinely support your cause. Others are motivated by fear and provide information to avoid punishment. Still others are motivated by ambition and provide intelligence in hopes of advancement. Each type of source has different reliability characteristics and requires different management techniques. The loyal source provides the most reliable information about matters within his knowledge but may filter or interpret intelligence in ways that he believes will please you rather than ways that accurately reflect reality. The fearful source may provide accurate intelligence about immediate threats but is likely to exaggerate dangers and may invent threats to maintain his perceived value. The ambitious source often provides the most comprehensive intelligence but may manipulate information to discredit rivals or advance his own position within your organization. Managing these different types of sources requires constant cross-checking and verification. The skilled ruler never relies on a single source for critical intelligence but instead builds multiple independent networks that can confirm or contradict each other's reports. He also periodically tests the reliability of his sources by providing them with false information to see how it is disseminated, or by asking them to report on matters where he already knows the truth. The psychological toll of maintaining eternal vigilance cannot be underestimated. The ruler who truly understands the nature of power finds himself in a position of fundamental isolation, unable to trust completely even those closest to him, constantly calculating the loyalty and reliability of every relationship. This isolation is not merely professional but existential, the recognition that his position sets him apart from normal human relationships in ways that can never be fully bridged. This isolation often manifests in what appears to be coldness or emotional distance but is actually a form of psychological self-protection. The ruler who allows himself to become too emotionally invested in particular relationships may find his judgment compromised when those relationships come into conflict with his political necessities. The man who treats his advisors as friends may hesitate to dismiss them when they become liabilities. The leader who views his subordinates as family may be unable to discipline them when discipline is necessary. Yet this emotional distance must be carefully managed to avoid becoming genuine callousness. The ruler who loses all capacity for human connection will find himself governing subjects he cannot understand and surrounded by advisors who fear to tell him the truth. The optimal approach involves maintaining emotional reserves, the ability to care about people and causes while preserving the detachment necessary to make difficult decisions when circumstances require them. The legacy considerations that occupy the minds of aging rulers reveal another dimension of the eternal vigilance required to maintain power. The leader who has devoted his life to achieving and maintaining dominance eventually faces the question of what will happen to his life's work after his death or retirement. This concern often leads to attempts to ensure smooth succession, but such attempts frequently fail because they misunderstand the nature of the power being transferred. Power is not a possession that can be bequeathed like property or wealth. It is a relationship that must be continuously earned and maintained. The heir apparent who has not developed his own capacity for strategic ruthlessness and eternal vigilance will find himself unable to maintain the position his predecessor created for him. The institutions and systems that supported the previous ruler may not transfer their loyalty to his successor, particularly if that successor appears weak or inexperienced. Understanding this reality, the wise ruler focuses not on guaranteeing his successor's position but on building systems and institutions that can survive leadership transitions. He creates multiple power centers that must cooperate to govern effectively, preventing any single individual or faction from dominating completely. He establishes traditions and procedures that constrain future rulers while providing them with the tools necessary to govern. He builds loyalty to institutions and principles rather than to himself personally, recognizing that such loyalty will outlast his own tenure. The final recognition that comes with mastery of power is perhaps the most profound, the understanding that true strength lies not in the accumulation of power for its own sake but in the wisdom to use power in service of something greater than oneself. The ruler who seeks dominance merely to satisfy his ego will find himself constantly threatened by others who seek the same satisfaction. The ruler who wields power in service of principles, people, or causes that transcend his personal interests creates a foundation for authority that extends beyond his individual capabilities. This is not a return to the naive virtue that characterizes the sheep, but rather a sophisticated understanding of how virtue can serve power and power can serve virtue. The wolf who protects his pack does so not from weakness but from strength, not from sentiment but from strategic understanding that his own survival depends on the welfare of the group he leads. Similarly, the human ruler who genuinely serves the interests of his people builds a foundation of loyalty and legitimacy that makes his position more secure than any amount of fear or manipulation could achieve. The transformation from sheep to wolf is ultimately not about becoming more brutal or ruthless than one's competitors, but about developing the strength, wisdom, and resilience necessary to survive in an environment where such qualities are required for effectiveness. It is about destroying the weak aspects of oneself not to become evil, but to become capable of good in circumstances where conventional goodness is insufficient. The man who completes this transformation finds himself not corrupted by power but purified by it, stripped of illusions and comfortable lies, forced to confront reality in its rawest form, and thereby enabled to act with a clarity and effectiveness that remains forever beyond the reach of those who refuse to acknowledge the true nature of the world they inhabit. In the end, the wolf among sheep serves not as a predator but as a protector, not as a destroyer but as a guardian of order in a world where chaos is always threatening to break through the thin veneer of civilization. His strength allows others to be weak, his hardness allows others to remain soft, his vigilance allows others to sleep peacefully. This is the true burden and the true honor of power, to bear the weight of reality so that others may enjoy the luxury of their illusions, to make the hard choices so that others may preserve their innocence, to destroy the enemies of peace so that peace itself may flourish. The man who destroys his weak self in this service becomes indestructible not because he cannot be physically harmed, but because he has aligned himself with forces and principles that extend far beyond his individual existence. He has become something larger than himself, a vessel for the expression of will and wisdom that transcends personal limitation. In losing his weakness, he has found his true strength. In accepting isolation, he has achieved genuine connection. In embracing the harsh realities of power, he has discovered the profound responsibilities of leadership. This is the ultimate victory of the wolf, not the domination of others, but the conquest of self.